Few kinds of seafood are more delicious than shrimp. Actually, I don't really believe that because I'm vegetarian. But at any rate, some people think that shrimp are delicious. Delicious enough that they pay millions of dollars every year for shrimp that are caught off the Gulf Coast of the United States, in states like, say, Louisiana. However, over the last several decades, shrimp fishermen off the Gulf Coast have noticed an alarming trend. And this is that trend. There's a tremendous amount of noise in these data. Shrimp populations go up and down dramatically from one year to the next, but the long-term trend is pretty clear. These colored bars are the averages for 4 consecutive decades, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you can see what's happening. These numbers are going down. What are these numbers? They are the catch per unit effort. Okay, the number of kilograms per hectare that shrimp fishermen have been able to bring in from the Gulf of Mexico. It's per unit effort because obviously if you send out more boats one year, you're going to get more shrimp. What they've done is they've taken the catch and divided it either by the number of boats or by the number of people working on the boats. And that's where they've gotten these statistics from. At any rate, the point is that shrimpers off the Gulf Coast have had to work much harder every year to bring in the same amount of shrimp. Shrimp are becoming scarce, and that is a big deal for a lot of people's livelihoods. Why is this happening? Well, you can actually see the reason from space. Here it is. This is the mouth of the Mississippi River, the Big Muddy, as it's nicknamed, emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. And sure enough, you can see a lot of mud. You can see a lot of silt that's washing out into the Gulf. But good heavens, what is all this green stuff? There's a lot of it. There's a lot of green stuff that appears at the mouth of the Mississippi where it washes out in the ocean. It's not just limited to Louisiana either. This plume of green makes its way all the way down the coast into Texas, down into Mexico, and so on down the coast of Central America for some distance. This is a satellite photo. So you can actually see this gigantic green something making its way down the Gulf Coast all the way from outer space. What is this? Well, believe it or not, this problem actually doesn't start in Louisiana. It starts up in the upper Midwest. The upper Midwest is some of the best agricultural land on the planet. But even though it's very rich agricultural land, farmers find it necessary to add more nutrients to the soil there. The primary nutrient in fertilizer that's placed in agricultural fields is nitrogen. And if you look at a map of where nitrogen shows up in waterways in the United States, it looks like this. These colors denote the amount of nitrogen that's found in streams in the years 1988 to 1999. And these purple areas, the amount of nitrogen that you find in those streams is something like between 9 and 15 times what you would expect to find in a stream where there wasn't any agriculture happening. That's a tremendous amount of nitrogen. It's what's called a very, very high nitrogen load in those streams. And it's worth mentioning that all of this area that's colored in here drains to the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River has this huge catchment that covers a huge amount of the North American continent. So that water which falls all the way up here in Canada will trickle into streams that eventually make their way into the Missouri River, that eventually make their way into the Mississippi, and out into the Gulf of Mexico. All that water is carrying with it a huge amount of nitrogen. The reason for this is largely because of fertilizer. There are a lot of other forms of nitrogen that human beings deal with that have to do with agriculture. So for example, as people plant more legumes, for reasons that we'll get to, there ends up being more free nitrogen in the soil. Animal poop, thank goodness, has not changed a lot in concentration over the last several decades, but you can see what happened here with fertilizer. This trend actually started not too long before this graph starts. At the end of World War II, there were a lot of factories that had been built to make ammonium. Ammonium is a very important chemical that's used in the manufacture of explosives, which is something you like to have a lot of when you're having a war. But after the war was all done, nobody knew what to do with these chemical plants until somebody hit on the bright idea of, hey, we could make this ammonia and we could dump it on the soil where we're trying to grow crops because plants need lots of nitrogen. That idea, like this red line on the graph, took off. And now all over the world, wherever you find industrial agriculture, you have high amounts of nitrogen fertilizer being added to the soil. Okay, so let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. And again, as with the carbon cycle, what I want to do is start by looking at what happens before human beings got involved, or what happens minus the effect of human beings. And let's take a look at the major reservoirs. There are only a couple that we really need to be concerned about. The main reservoir for nitrogen on this planet is the atmosphere. Nitrogen gas makes up most of the atmosphere. And you can see here that the amount of nitrogen that's present in the atmosphere is gigantic, especially compared to the amounts that are found in the soil or in living organisms on land, and in the water and in living organisms in the water. These amounts of nitrogen are just paltry compared to this. There are some other places where you find nitrogen, but honestly, we're not even going to worry about how much nitrogen is found in those reservoirs because it's really too small to be worried about. How does nitrogen make its way from the atmosphere to the organic matter in the soil? Well, this is one of these interesting cases where the element has to change its molecular form before organisms can use it. When this happens, when an element needs to change form before it can be used, that change in form is called fixation. Atmospheric nitrogen is N2. It's two nitrogen atoms triple bonded to one another. And that is an incredibly strong molecular bond. It's very, very difficult to break. And there are only a few organisms on Earth that can actually do it. The problem with molecular nitrogen is it's absolutely unusable by almost all organisms on Earth. You need nitrogen to make amino acids. That's the amine in amino acids, is a group, a chemical group that contains a nitrogen atom. You also need nitrogen to make RNA and DNA. So nitrogen is vital for living things. But all of this atmospheric nitrogen is totally unavailable to almost all the living things on Earth. It's totally unavailable until it is fixed by some process. Lightning will actually bust apart nitrogen molecules and make them into things like ammonium. But most of the natural fixation on Earth is due to microbes. In general, if you are wondering about some kind of molecular metabolic process that shifts an element from one form to another, it's going to be some microbe that is doing it. Microbes have a tremendous number of ways in which they transform chemical compounds into one another. And it's one of their very, very important roles in a lot of nutrient cycles, including this one. In the roots of many plants, especially those in the pea and bean family, there are little nodules. They almost look like little warts that grow on the roots of the plant. What those are is they're homes that the plant builds for particular kinds of bacteria. And the plant wants to be really nice to those bacteria and have them living close. because these are bacteria that can take the nitrogen out of the air and make it into ammonium. This is a form that plants can actually take up and make into great things like amino acids and nucleic acids. So this is incredibly useful. What the plants do, what bean and pea plants do, is they feed sugar to the bacteria that can fix nitrogen, and they provide nice little safe homes for them. So those bacteria move in, make themselves comfortable, and start cranking out usable nitrogen that the plants can exploit. Because there's a lot of stuff that goes on within a living community that I'm not going to go over. Okay? The ammonium gets changed to nitrites and nitrates. Those can get changed back into ammonium and so on. There's a cycle that goes on here. Don't worry about it. Ultimately, what happens is that nitrogen gets taken up by producers. And then when they die, it ends up going back into the soil organic matter. Some of these conversions can happen and then it gets taken up again. One thing I want you to notice is the size of this flux on a yearly basis compared to, say, this size. On land alone, the uptake of nitrogen by land plants is 10 times faster than all of the fixation of nitrogen in the entire world. That's interesting. What it means is that basically nitrogen is cycling very tightly through this loop here. Almost as soon as it is released, free nitrogen is sucked up by some plant and reassimilated into the living biomass. Now, it's not every nitrogen atom that this happens to. There is a lot of nitrogen hanging out in dead organic matter here in the soil. But on the whole, plants and most other living organisms are very hungry for nitrogen. Every so often, you get some of the nitrogen actually gets metabolized. There are bacteria that get energy from these nitrogen-containing molecules. They metabolize those molecules, and those molecules become atmospheric nitrogen, or the nitrogen becomes atmospheric nitrogen again. This process is called denitrification, and it's a flux that moves nitrogen back out of the cycle involving living things into the atmosphere. Basically, all the same stuff is happening in the oceans. Okay, you have fixation, you have denitrification going the other way. To a certain extent, dust from the land actually will land in the ocean and introduce more nitrogen. But the thing I really want to draw your attention to is this here. Said that the assimilation was very rapid on land. It's even much more rapid in the water. Much, much more rapid. Okay, the nitrogen fixation that's happening off at sea, say, is happening at a rate of about 150 billion tons per year. The cycling, though, is happening at 8 trillion tons per year, a much, much larger amount than this. What this means basically is that nitrogen is almost never lost from the aquatic ecosystem. As soon as it is released, it is sucked back up again. There's a huge amount of nitrogen that's kind of floating around in living organisms and the ocean, and it tends to be cycled very tightly. Very little of it is released. In fact, this is the amount that is generally released by living organisms in the ocean. Of that 8,000 billion tons cycling every year, maybe 10 billion tons get lost, they get buried at the bottom of the sea, and they become sedimentary rock. Nitrogen does move from the land to the water, but I'm going to get to why this is in just a minute. There are two ways that human beings have changed the nitrogen cycle, and one of them, as you might imagine, involves our old friend fossil fuels. Remember that fossil fuels are the remains of dead organisms. And even though organisms are mostly carbon-based organisms, there is a substantial percentage of nitrogen in the body of any living thing. And when they die and get compressed into, say, gasoline or coal, that nitrogen stays in that deposit of fossil fuels. When the fossil fuels are taken out of the Earth's crust and burned in industry or in automobiles, that nitrogen is emitted into the atmosphere as some form of nitrogen oxide. This can be NO or NO2 or NO3. And the rate at which this happens is pretty substantial. It's not nearly as big as natural biological fixation of nitrogen on land or in the ocean, but it's a reasonable amount of nitrogen that's being released from the burning of fossil fuels. Some of that ends up going into the rivers and washing into the sea. Some of that ends up making its way down into the ground and infiltrates groundwater supplies. You don't need to worry about this very much. Just realize that the burning of fossil fuels causes our groundwater to change. Finally, there are two other things that human beings do that has really changed the nitrogen cycle. One is that we've planted a lot of nitrogen-fixing crops, like, say, soybeans. Of course, beans and legumes, the bean and pea family of plants, contain a lot of species that we love to eat. And one of the reasons that we eat beans and peas is that they are very nitrogen rich. They contain a lot of protein. The plants can afford to make all this protein because they have some teammates growing in their roots, fixing nitrogen for them. However, as I mentioned, the big shift here is fertilizer production. The amount of fertilizer that is produced every year, the rate at which fertilizer is produced every year, is higher than the rate of the biological fixation that occurs by all bacteria on all land masses all across the planet. That's how much fertilizer is being produced each year by human beings. It's a tremendous amount. In fact, and this was the case a few years ago, this I believe is even more extreme now. In fact, when you add up all of the nitrogen that is being fixed each year by natural causes, and you add up the amount that is fixed each year due to, or is released in the environment each year from human sources, they're actually about the same size. In fact, I think now this figure is a little bit out of date. I think now actually, this stacked bar over here is much taller than this one. In essence, we've more than doubled the amount of nitrogen in the world that is available for plant growth. And it shouldn't be a surprise to you that doubling a major flux in a nutrient cycle really changes what that nutrient cycle does. This can have some pretty bad effects, particularly in aquatic ecosystems. You might think that adding nitrogen to an ecosystem would be good for it. And I mean, that's why we add nitrogen fertilizer to our agricultural areas. Usually that's why we're growing nitrogen fixing crops, is to replenish the nitrogen in the soil that was depleted last season by, say, growing corn. However, as all that fertilizer makes its way into the Mississippi River and then out into the Gulf of Mexico, something rather disastrous happens. Here's the situation. Over here we've got a freshwater river like the Mississippi flowing out in the ocean. When that fresh water meets the ocean, it actually forms this kind of very thin lens over the top. And the reason for that is that fresh water is lighter, it's less dense than seawater. So rather than mixing right in, it tends to float in this thin layer, overlaying the colder, denser salt water. Okay, all of the nutrients that came into the ocean along with this fresh water are now concentrated in this thin lens right at the surface of the ocean. The nitrogen that's found here is a very important resource for plankton or algae that capture the sun's energy and make it into food. Because this lens is right at the surface of the water, it also means that these organisms are getting lots and lots of light. So as soon as they receive this unusual pulse of nitrogen from a water that has a lot of fertilizer in it, those single-celled organisms, these producers, these algae, are going to go gangbusters. This can be a dramatic understatement. It says here that the phytoplankton, the photosynthetic plankton, flourish at the surface. It can be a tremendous population boom, and that has some unfortunate consequences. What happens is that a lot of the algae, the phytoplankton, just sort of die. They get old and die. They don't get eaten up by fish, but instead their bodies just drift down to the bottom of the ocean, where it's very cold and dark. In turn, what this does is it serves as a massive subsidy for organisms that live on the bottom of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. These are mostly bacteria. They are going to have their own little population boom as a result of all the food that they are being given. And one thing that's important about the bacteria that live at the bottom of the ocean is that they are heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. It's too dark down here to capture enough sunlight. So they have to wait for high energy compounds to trickle down from above, and then they gobble them up. Organisms that are heterotrophic typically use oxygen in their metabolism. And that's true for most of the decomposers at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. They take oxygen from the water surrounding them. They use it in the process of energy capture, and then they release carbon dioxide into the water. However, although oxygen moves by diffusion through water, it does not move very quickly. It takes a long time for a molecule of oxygen, of atmospheric oxygen, kind of up here at the surface of the water, to accidentally bump into the surface of the water, and then by slow Brownian motion jiggling, make its way all the way down to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. Because the rate at which oxygen can be replenished down here in these deep parts is very slow, then if oxygen use accelerates past a certain rate, it will actually use up all of the oxygen in the water. And basically what happens is when you fertilize the algae at the top of the Gulf of Mexico, the dead stuff that sinks to the bottom causes a decomposer population boom so dramatic that the decomposers use up all the oxygen at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. This is bad for all kinds of living things. Generally, most of the decomposers that cause this problem are going to die, but it also suffocates all sorts of other animals, some of which are financially or economically very important. Things like oysters and fish and shrimp cannot tolerate low oxygen levels. And the oxygen levels in the Gulf of Mexico, after there's been a lot of fertilizer running downstream, can be remarkably low. Today, thousands of square miles of the Gulf of Mexico have low levels of oxygen. That is to say, they are hypoxic. And much of the area is practically anoxic. It's practically oxygen-free down there because the decomposers have flourished so well that they've used up all of the oxygen they needed to survive. I like this graph because it actually shows you some of the concentrations of oxygen. A normal level of dissolved oxygen in water is about 7.5. Well, people went around and they took water samples from various different depths at various different locations off of the coast of Louisiana. And here are some of the numbers they found. At some places, oxygen contents are nearly normal, but at some places in the Gulf of Mexico, the amount of oxygen is practically zero. You can see these huge swaths of red on this graph a tremendous amount of area where the oxygen levels are at maybe 1 out of 7, 1 out of 8, the normal level, or less. So there's a tremendous amount of area where basically everything at the bottom of the ocean has suffocated. And it's because of changes to the nitrogen cycle. This isn't limited, sadly, to the Mississippi River. The white dots on this chart show where there are dead zones, these hypoxic or anoxic areas off the coast, where these white dots show where these dead zones are found worldwide. And pretty much anywhere where you have industrial agriculture, you have too much nitrogen getting into the water, and so when that passes out into the sea, you get the chain reaction that causes a dead zone. We haven't talked about the phosphorus cycle yet, but phosphorus causes some very similar problems. In many lakes, it's phosphorus rather than nitrogen that limits the growth of algae. And so if you add too much phosphorus to a lovely clean lake, you get a lake that looks like this instead. This is a gigantic algal bloom. And in addition to making the lake look very nasty, when these algae die and sink to the bottom, the decomposers that rejoice and feast upon their corpses will suck all the oxygen out of the lake, quite literally, and leave the whole area a dead lake. The effect can be tremendous. I mean, you can see it here from the air, an unpolluted waterway, a waterway where there wasn't any pollution by phosphorus. And here's an area where phosphorus was accidentally released into an aquatic ecosystem. The difference is pretty stark. This process, this runaway chain reaction that causes a dead zone is called eutrophication. It means good eaten. But really what happens is that a lake like this is eating itself to death. A proper healthy aquatic ecosystem actually looks like there's not much living there. So when you see something like this that looks rich and productive and green, something has gone badly wrong.